All right, let's just dive right in, shall we? Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're basically putting on our lab coats and taking a hard, analytical look at a topic that usually gets completely lost in science fiction and conspiracy theories, the recently released Pentagon UFO files. We're going to strip away all the sensationalism, the spooky music, the internet rumors, and instead, we're going to conduct a rigorous scientific audit of the newly released data.
It's the big one, right? The question dominating every media headline and late-night documentary. Are aliens real? Have we finally been visited? You know, it's a fascinating thought experiment, but as scientific researchers, we can't really operate on fun what-ifs. We have to operate on hard data. So let's pivot away from those sensational headlines for a bit and look at what the empirical evidence actually tells us about these files.
And what does that hard empirical evidence actually tell us? Well, zero. Literally zero. There is strictly zero publicly verified empirical evidence of extraterrestrial life in any of these released Pentagon files. No matter what the pundits suggest on TV, from a strictly scientific standpoint, the confirmed extraterrestrial dataset is exactly zero. To understand why that number is zero, despite all the recent hype, we need a methodical approach. So, here's our roadmap for this explainer. We'll start with the Pentagon's UFO dataset. Then we'll audit those famous Navy videos, touch on sensor errors and anomalies, look at the glaring lack of empirical data, and finally arrive at a scientific conclusion.
All right, kicking things off with Section 1, the Pentagon's UFO dataset.
Look, to evaluate any current claims, we kind of have to understand the historical context, right? For decades, the military has quietly cataloged anomalies as preliminary datasets. Starting way back in the 1940s with Roswell, which, by the way, we now know is actually a top-secret balloon project to detect Soviet nuclear tests. We see the public's fascination ignite. Then you have Project Blue Book in the 50s and 60s, and the classified ATIP program in the 2000s. There's a really consistent pattern here. The government hasn't been covering up alien biology. They've been running an ongoing exercise in cataloging airspace anomalies. And that brings us to the 2017 major Pentagon leaks, which basically blew this dataset wide open to public scrutiny.
Moving right along to Section 2, auditing the Navy videos.
Now, this is where we really need to shift our focus away from the visual spectacle of the internet and move toward a strict analysis of the observational data. I'm sure you've seen them, the Tic Tac, the gimbal, and the Go Fast clips. The Pentagon did officially confirm that this is real military footage. And when we extract the data points from these videos, we're seeing reports of objects with no visible engines, no wings, and no typical exhaust heat signatures. These are fascinating physical anomalies, absolutely. But as skeptical scientists, we have to remember, observing a weird anomaly in low-resolution targeting footage does not automatically validate the extraterrestrial hypothesis. It simply means we have an incomplete picture. Then, alongside the footage, you have the witness accounts. Take this quote from a military pilot. "It accelerated like nothing I've ever seen." Now that is super compelling. These are highly trained observers. However, in scientific research, human testimony is notoriously subjective. When hard, empirical data is blurry or just completely missing, human perception naturally steps in to bridge that gap. The pilot is describing what their brain interpreted in a highly stressful environment, not necessarily providing a verified kinematic measurement.
And this really highlights the critical divide we have to navigate here. On one hand, you've got these subjective claims of impossible acceleration and objects just totally defying known physics. But on the other hand, you have the grounded, scientifically probable realities admitted right there in the source text. Drones, weather balloons, and, critically, sensor errors. Scientific rigor demands that we exhaust every single one of those probable variables before we even begin to entertain extraordinary claims.
Which perfectly segues into Section 3, sensor errors and anomalies.
This is the absolute core of our scientific critique, guys. We have to question the reliability of the instrumentation itself. In a rigorous scientific context, the word unidentified basically just means we have insufficient empirical data to determine this object's origin. It is emphatically not proof of extraterrestrial existence. When a radar operator tracks a craft moving at impossible speeds or an object goes officially unidentified, it often just means the data collected was too degraded, fragmented, or corrupted to actually make a positive ID.
The new Pentagon files give us quite a variety of data formats to look at: infrared images, radar tracking data, visual reports of glowing spheres, and sightings over military bases. Now, the military confirms this data is real, meaning the sensors really did record an input. But the crucial point is that the interpretation of that data is often deeply flawed. A glare rotating on a gimbaled infrared lens can look exactly like a flying saucer.
A literal speck of ice or a glitching radar calibration can produce data showing completely impossible speeds. We just have to separate the raw sensor artifact from the extraordinary conclusion.
Let's pivot now to Section 4, the missing empirical data. If we're genuinely treating this as a true scientific audit, we have to address the most critical failing of the entire Pentagon narrative. Science requires undeniable proof. It's really that simple. Relying on blurry targeting pod videos, anecdotal pilot stories, and confused radar operators simply does not meet the threshold for a major scientific discovery. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and right now the dataset we have is entirely observational and highly ambiguous.
So let's do a quick, systematic audit of what's actually missing. We have no recovered alien bodies, we have no confirmed spacecraft wreckage, 0 independently verified physical materials that we can stick under an electron microscope in a civilian lab. Without these physical data points, the extraterrestrial hypothesis remains entirely untestable. As skeptical researchers, until we can measure it, weigh it, or reproduce it, it stays firmly in the realm of speculation.
And that brings us to our final part, Section 5, a scientific conclusion.
Let's actually weigh these competing theories based on the limited dataset we just went through. Look, it's really easy to pit sensational theories like alien visitors or some classified military program with tech decades ahead of the public against scientific realities. But those realities include natural atmospheric phenomena, severe sensor distortions, or perhaps rare, undiscovered localized physics. Given the source documents we've analyzed, these grounded realities are statistically far more probable. Occam's razor dictates we absolutely must exhaust the sensor distortion theory long before we assume we've got visitors from another solar system.
Now, despite the total lack of evidence for aliens, just look at the massive institutional shift happening right now. NASA is conducting formal studies, Congress is holding official hearings, the whole stigma around this is basically gone. But here is what you really should take away from this. The true goal of these institutions isn't to prepare us for an alien invasion. The goal is correcting our deeply flawed data-gathering methodologies. They want better sensors, standardized reporting, and rigorous peer review so we finally stop getting tricked by blurry camera glare.
So, the bottom line is this. Unidentified does not mean inexplicable forever. These files, these leaked videos, they don't represent magic. They represent a gap in our current understanding and, far more importantly, a massive limitation in our current instrumentation. We are quite literally looking at the boundaries of what our cameras and radars can accurately process under extreme conditions.
Which leaves us with one final kind of provocative question to close out our audit. When we look at these Pentagon files and all these unexplained sightings, are we truly seeing new paradigm-shattering physics, or are we just seeing the limits and glitches of our own sensors? It's a question that demands rigorous scientific inquiry, not just wild speculation. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning the data, stay skeptical, and never stop learning.